Salvete discipuli. Today we're going to continue our discussion about the uses of the dative and add to our list of special verbs that take the dative. And as a quick review of the dative endings before we add on to our list of verbs that require the dative is of course the third case, the third noun case, as we go through our list in order of the nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, ablative, and vocative, or never give dogs any abuse, Vinny. In first declension, your dative endings are AE or IS. In second declension, an O or an IS, where first and second declension plurals are exactly the same. In third declension, it's either an I or ibus. In fourth declension, it is either a UI or an ibus, that U being very characteristic to the fourth declension. And third and fourth declensions have the exact same dative plural ending. And then in fifth declension, which has its characteristic E endings, it's either EI in the singular or ebus in the plural, the fifth declension plural being very similar to the third and fourth declension plurals. We've previously talked about how the dative case is most commonly used for indirect objects, the person or thing to or for whom something is said, given, or done, such as our example, Nuntius epistulam Cornelio tradit, a messenger hands a letter to Cornelius. Conversely, we can also translate this as a messenger hands Cornelius a letter. Either way, Cornelius is our dative indirect object because it is to him that the letter is being handed. We've also discussed the dative use with impersonal verbs, specifically with the impersonal verbs necessa est, it is necessary, or licet, it is allowed, such as in our translation example, nobis necessa est statim discedere, it is necessary for us to depart immediately, where for us is our dative use explaining for whom it is necessary, or if the verb were licet, for whom it is allowed. Finally, we've added to our uses of the dative by discussing compound verbs, verbs that take a prefix, and some of these prefixes require the dative case, such as our compound verb apropinquo, which is in essence ad plus the verb propinquo, meaning to approach. So when you approach the city, instead of using a direct object like we expect in the English, we're going to use the dative case. And that is strictly because the prefix ad requires a use of the dative. And just as a reminder, we can remember our mnemonic PS. Accio, a, sip, cup, to remember the various prefixes that usually require a dative case. And our two main verbs in Ecce Romani that show this use of the dative is apropinquo, to approach, or accurro, to meet. And finally, we're going to add to this discussion of the dative case by discussing some of the special verbs that also require a dative. And in English, we're going to use them like we do direct objects, almost as if they were receiving the action of the verb. However, in Latin, they're going to use the dative case because the Romans understood these verbs as having a more indirect relationship as opposed to the direct object accusative case and a direct relationship. So here our example, servus Cornelio servit, best translates to the slave serves Cornelius. And if we evaluate the English to begin with, slave is our subject doing the action, and the person or thing whom the slave serves is Cornelius. And in English, we're really understanding this relationship to be a direct relationship, the person or thing that the verb affects. However, in Latin, we can clearly see that this has a dative case ending, and that is because of how the Romans would have understood this word servit. The way to best understand why some of these special verbs require the dative is to think about the literal translation of these verbs. To understand what the literal translation of the verb is, we want to change that verb into a verb more common to indirect objects, a verb of giving or doing, and then change the verb into a noun. Let me show you what I mean. Instead of saying the slave serves Cornelius, we could instead say that the slave gives service to Cornelius. Instead of using the one verb of serving, we're instead going to use a verb that traditionally requires an indirect object, a verb of giving, and then we're going to take the idea represented in the verb servir and turn it into a noun so that in English we can better understand why Cornelius needs to be in the dative case. If we evaluate this English sentence, now we have the slave doing the action of the verb. The thing that he is giving is our direct object, and then to or for whom he is giving service is our dative indirect object in English. Now, of course, with this said, you do want to remember that this entire translation of the verb plus the direct object in English is all provided for by that one verb in the Latin. This rewriting of the more literal translation of the verb is just to help you understand how this verb and these verbs in Latin can require use of the dative when they are so very different to what we expect in the English. So once again, usually you just need to know the literal translation of the special verbs to serve as opposed to give service to understand why the dative is necessary. We do also have a mnemonic to help us remember these special verbs, and you want to remember to press the coffin press, whatever a coffin press may be. Please remember to press the coffin press. And as you watch the video, please make sure to pause the video so that you can write down the literal translations of these special verbs on the note sheet that I provided with the various uses of the dative case. Our first verbs in the first press, we have parere, to obey, which in a more literal sense is to be obedient to or to give obedience to. Resistere, which means to resist or to give resistance to. Servire, which means to serve, we've already seen means to give service to. Suadere or persuadere means to persuade, and alternatively the more literal translation is to make agreeable to. Our next four verbs are those present in coffin. Credere, to believe, more literally translates as to lend belief to or to give belief to. Favere, to favor, is to give favor or give preference to. Fidere, to trust, would also mean to give trust to. And imperare, to command, could alternatively or more literally mean to give an order to. And you can see that we're just following this exact same trend of changing our verb into one that more commonly takes an indirect object and then turning the main verb into a noun that in English we would use as a direct object. This opens up the ability in English to translate with an indirect object. Our final verbs are those in the second press. And it does seem like they're a little out of order. They should read number 2 and number 1. So let's start with number 1, placere, which means to please, or more literally to be pleasing to. Nocere, to harm, on the other hand, would mean to do harm to. Respondere means to respond or to give a response to. And studere, to desire, means to be eager for. Let's look at a couple of exemplia disciplia. In our first exemplum, that with our verb placent, which means to be pleasing or to please, we see ludi circenses mihi placent. Now our verb placent is very clearly in the third person plural, which means that ludi circenses is our subject. So the chariot racing is pleasing to me. And here to me is in the dative case. Now this first translation is the very literal translation in English that allows us to use a dative indirect object. However, an alternate translation, which is just as acceptable, is chariot racing pleases me, where, at least in the English, me is a direct object because it is the person that is being pleased. In our second example, nocuit neo riga, here we're using our verb nocere, to harm or to be harmful to, and this happens to be a yes or no question in the perfect tense. Because our verb is third person singular, we're going to translate this with a he, she, or it translation as a question. Was it harmful to the charioteer? Once again, auriga needs to be in the dative case because of our special verb nocere, and so our first translation is the more literal one, which allows for the translation of an indirect object in the English. Alternatively, and just as correctly, we could translate this as, did it hurt the charioteer? Where in English, we're translating this as if the charioteer directly receives the verb's action. Remember, Discipuli, either translation is perfectly okay. You just need to be prepared for a use of the dative with these new special verbs, be able to identify that it is in the dative case, and then explain why it is in the dative case. It's a dative case with a special verb.